In 1939, Hitler's high command laughed at reports of American coastal defense. They believed the U.S. was blind, protected only by water. They were dangerously wrong, and the price of that arrogance would be paid in steel and lives. Before Britain shared its secrets, America's coasts were supposedly wide open. Hitler was convinced of it. But what he didn't know was that a handful of U.S. Army scientists were working on a secret that would change the war, even if their own generals didn't believe them. We remember the heroes of the battlefield, but some of the most important battles were fought in laboratories. When Hitler mocked America's primitive defenses, he missed a quiet, determined effort on the shores of New Jersey that was about to make him regret it. Before Britain shared its secrets, America's coasts were supposedly wide open. Hitler was convinced of it, but what he didn't know was that a handful of U.S. Army scientists were working on a secret that would change the war, even if their own generals didn't believe them. This secret was a direct answer to a terrifying new problem, a problem that men who had served in the Great War were struggling to even comprehend. Why did Hitler and his entire general staff feel so utterly confident in the early days of the war? Why did they look at the United States, with its vast industrial might, and feel such dismissive arrogance? To understand that, we have to put ourselves in their jackboots. The year is 1939. The world is holding its breath. Germany has just unleashed a new kind of war on Poland, a war of speed, terror, and above all, air power. The Stuka dive bomber, with its terrifying siren, has become a symbol of this new age. The Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring's pride, seems invincible. They look across the English Channel and they see a small island protected by the Royal Navy, but they also see a target. Then they look across the Atlantic and they see nothing. To the German High Command, America was a sleeping giant, yes, but one defended by two vast empty oceans. They saw a nation that had turned its back on the world after 1918, a nation that had slashed its military budget to the bone during the lean years of the Depression. They saw a country obsessed with itself, with its movie stars and its automobiles, a nation of merchants, as one German attaché reportedly wrote, not a nation of warriors. And what about its coastal defenses? The German intelligence reports that filter back to Berlin painted a picture that was almost comical. America's defense of its thousands of miles of coastline was based on technology and tactics from 1917. It was a handful of massive coastal artillery guns pointing out to sea, designed to fight a surface battleship that would likely never come. It was a scattered network of civilian spotters, the Aircraft Warning Service, which amounted to patriotic men and women sitting on rooftops with a pair of binoculars and a telephone. This was the core of the German Mockery. They had mastered the art of the surprise air attack. They believed with deep conviction that any war could be won in the first 48 hours with a decisive blow from the sky. And how could America ever stop such a blow? A bomber flying at night or in the thick fog so common off the New England coast would be invisible. It would be over its target, dropping its payload before the first air raid siren could even begin to wail. Hitler in particular was known to have a deep, almost superstitious contempt for America's capabilities. He saw its mixed society as weak, decadent, and incapable of the unified, fanatical will to fight. He was convinced that the U.S. Army was a third-rate organization, a token force. And in 1939, he wasn't entirely wrong. The U.S. Army was smaller than the Army of Belgium. Its Air Corps was a tiny, neglected branch, flying planes that were often obsolete the moment they rolled off the assembly line. So when whispers emerged of American experiments with radiolocation, the Germans simply didn't believe it. Their own scientists were working on similar concepts like the Freya and Würzburg systems, but they assumed the Americans, with their clumsy bureaucratic military, were decades behind. They were, in a word, blind, and Hitler felt secure in that knowledge. But this is where the story truly begins, because the German High Command made a classic, fatal mistake. They mistook isolationism for incompetence. They mistook a peacetime military for a permanent lack of ingenuity. And they completely failed to understand the quiet, stubborn work being done by a handful of men they had never even heard of. The problem, however, wasn't just German arrogance. It was American bureaucracy. In the 1930s, the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy were not partners, they were bitter rivals. They fought each other tooth and nail for every dollar of the meager defense budget. They hoarded secrets from each other. They duplicated research, and they viewed each other with a suspicion that bordered on paranoia. The Navy was working on its own crude radar sets to detect ships. The Army, meanwhile, was focused on the ground.
And in the Army, the Signal Corps was the branch responsible for all things communication. They were the ones who laid telegraph wires, ran field radios, and as technology progressed, began to explore the strange new world of radio waves. They were based in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, a place of damp fields and relentless mosquitoes, far from the polished halls of power in Washington. Here, a brilliant, soft-spoken engineer named Colonel William Blair had been fascinated by an idea. Back in the 1920s, he and his colleagues had noticed a strange phenomenon. When airplanes flew through the path of a radio broadcast, the signal would flutter and warp. It was an annoyance, but to Blair, it was a clue. He wondered, could you use this flutter to detect a plane on purpose? This was the birth of American radar. It wasn't born from a desire to shoot down a bomber, but from a simple peacetime question: how can we help pilots navigate safely in the fog? Throughout the early 1930s, Blair and his civilian team, men like Paul Watson and Harold Zoll, tinkered. They were the classic American inventors, men who worked in sheds, who used coffee pots and scrap metal to build their contraptions. By 1936, they had a working, if primitive, prototype. They called it a radio location device. It was a mess of wires, antennas, and glowing vacuum tubes, but it worked. They set it up at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, and managed to track a B-10 bomber from miles away. They were ecstatic. They believed they had changed the world. So they invited the top brass from the Army Air Corps to come and see it. This, they thought, was their moment. The generals arrived, looked at the bulky, strange machine, and listened patiently. The scientists explained how it could see in the dark. Then the generals asked their questions. Could it tell you how many planes there were? No. Could it tell you what kind of plane? No. Could it tell you if it was friendly or hostile? No. The generals were deeply, profoundly unimpressed. Men who had built their careers on horseback and in the trenches of France simply couldn't wrap their minds around it. It was a novelty, a toy. One general famously put his hand on a young scientist's shoulder and said something to the effect of, "Son, that's a very clever machine, but the best aircraft detector in the world is a man with a good pair of field glasses and a sharp ear. Don't waste your time." The project was almost killed. Funding was denied. The team was heartbroken. This was the real vulnerability that Hitler's Germany was benefiting from. It wasn't just that America lacked the technology, it was that America's own leadership refused to believe in it. The mockery from Berlin was being echoed, in a way, by the skepticism in Washington. We found that this kind of story, where innovation is blocked by the very people who need it most, is a theme that repeats throughout history. It's a human story. If you're finding this part of the journey as fascinating as we do, a simple like on the video is a powerful way to tell us you want more of these forgotten histories. It truly does help us decide what to investigate next. But the team at the Signal Corps was stubborn. Colonel Blair, in particular, refused to let the idea die. He couldn't get funding for aircraft detection, so he got creative. He disguised the research under different budget items. He called it a radio navigation tool. He called it a meteorological device for tracking weather balloons. He did whatever it took to keep the lights on in that New Jersey shed. And they kept working. They knew the field glasses argument was a dead end. The new bombers, the B-17s that were just coming into service, were flying higher and faster than any plane before. They flew above the clouds. You couldn't hear them until it was too late. The old way was broken. A new way had to be found. So they pressed on, often on their own time, fueled by a conviction that bordered on obsession. They made a breakthrough. Their early models were continuous wave systems, which were easily jammed and couldn't tell you the range to the target very well. But the team, particularly the brilliant Harold Zoll, developed a new pulse system. This was the revolution. Instead of sending out a continuous beam, the pulse system sent out a short, powerful pop of radio energy. Then it would switch to a receiver and listen for the echo. By timing how long it took for that echo to return, they could calculate with incredible precision the distance to the target. This new idea led to the SCR-268, America's first truly practical radar. It was still bulky, still designed to help aim searchlights and anti-aircraft guns, but it worked. And now a few people in Washington began to pay attention. Not the top generals, not yet, but the younger officers, the men who actually flew the planes and understood the terrifying three-dimensional nature of the coming war.
They saw the 268, and they said, this is good, but it's not enough. We don't just need to aim our guns, we need to see what's coming. We need to see them from 100 miles away. They needed an early warning system. And that demand gave birth to the machine that would finally silence Hitler's Mockery. It was called, in the simple bureaucratic language of the Army, the SCR-270. Radio Set Component Model 270. It was a monster. It was a massive antenna array, over 100 feet wide, mounted on the back of a heavy-duty truck. It required 4 trucks to move. One for the antenna, one for the transmitter, one for the operator shack, and one for the power generator. It was a beast, a lumbering, crude-looking giant. But it had a secret. By using a lower frequency, it could hurl a powerful pulse of energy into the sky and detect a high-flying bomber from over 150 miles away. This was, in 1939, a staggering achievement. It was in many ways superior to the British chain-home system. Why? Because chain-home was a brilliant but static defense. It was a line of massive towers built along the coast of England. It couldn't move. Hitler's bombers could, and did, simply fly around it. But the SCR-270, it was mobile. You could drive it anywhere, set it up on a hill, and in a few hours, create a 150-mile defensive bubble. It was a radar on wheels. And this is the part of the story that most people get wrong. The popular history, the one you see in the movies, is that America was technologically backwards until the British saved us. The story centers on the Tizard Mission in 1940. And that mission was a pivotal moment. The British, desperate for American industry, arrived carrying a black box full of their most precious secrets. Inside that box was the cavity magnetron, a device no bigger than a shoebox that could generate microwave frequency radio waves. It was the single most important invention of the war. It would later allow for radar sets small enough to fit into the nose of a night fighter or a bomber. It was a quantum leap. But when that British delegation, led by Sir Henry Tizard, arrived in Washington, the Americans had a surprise of their own. They listened politely as the British explained their chain-home system. Then the Signal Corps officers said, "That's very impressive. Now, let us show you what we've been working on." They drove the British delegation out to a field, and there, parked in the mud, was the SCR-270. The scientists, with their sophisticated magnetron, looked at this giant crude antenna array, and they were skeptical. It looked like something built in the backyard, which in many ways it was. And then the Americans turned it on. The generator roared to life. The operator, sitting in his shack, began to call out plots. Target, bearing, 040, range, 120 miles. The British watched, their skepticism turning to stunned silence. A plane, invisible to the eye, was being tracked perfectly. They had nothing like this. They had long-range detection, and the Americans had long-range detection, but the Americans had put theirs on a truck. The Mockery from Berlin, the idea that America was a nation of amateurs, was based on a complete failure of intelligence. They assumed, as did the British, that America was just waiting to be taught. They never imagined the parallel independent innovation that was happening in those mosquito-filled fields. This moment was a turning point. The Americans and the British immediately agreed to pool their research. The British gave the Americans the Magnetron, which would revolutionize airborne radar, and the Americans gave the British the SCR-270, which would be deployed around the world, from the shores of England to the deserts of Africa. The technology was proven. The skeptics were silenced. And the U.S. Army, finally fully awake, began to rush these new radar sets into production. They sent them to the Panama Canal, they sent them to the Philippines, and they sent them to a string of pearls chain of islands in the Pacific, America's front line against the rising sun of Japan. One of those radar sets, one of the very first production models, was loaded onto a ship and sent to a sleepy tropical outpost, a place most Americans only knew from postcards. It was sent to the island of Oahu in the territory of Hawaii. But this brings us to one of the most painful what-ifs in all of American history. Because as the scientists in New Jersey had learned years before, having a machine that works is not the same as having a system that works. The machine can see, but the men behind it have to know what they are looking at, and they have to be allowed to act. The Army set up a network of these new SCR-270s on the high hills of Oahu. One of them was placed at a spot called Opana on the island's northernmost tip. The men assigned to it were young, barely trained, and just learning this new, almost magical technology. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, two Army privates, Joseph Lockard and George Elliott, were on duty. Their shift was supposed to end at 7 a.m. They were tired, they were hungry, and they were getting ready to shut the set down and go get breakfast. But Lockard, the more experienced operator, decided to keep it on for a little bit longer just for practice. The machine was still new and he wanted the extra time. At 7:02 a.m., George Elliott, the man watching the oscilloscope screen, saw something that made his blood run cold. A blip appeared on the screen. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the screen was filled with a massive pulsating return. It was a formation of aircraft larger than anything he had ever seen, bigger than any flight of B-17s, bigger than the entire U.S. air fleet on the island. And it was approaching from the north, 137 miles away. He called to Lockard. Lockard checked the machine. It was working perfectly. This was not a glitch. This was real.
They did their duty. They picked up the telephone and called the information center at Fort Shafter. The officer on duty, a lieutenant named Kermit Tyler, took the call. He was new. It was his first day. He listened to the two excited, panicked privates on the other end of the line. And then he made the single most tragic assumption of the war. He knew a flight of American B-17 bombers was scheduled to arrive from California that morning. They were flying in, without ammunition, to reinforce the island. He assumed that's what Lockard and Elliott were seeing. He told them, "Don't worry about it." Back at Opana, Lockard and Elliott were confused. They knew this was not a normal flight of B-17s. The return was too large, but they had their orders. Don't worry about it. So they shrugged. They kept tracking the formation as it closed in, 100 miles, 80 miles, 60 miles. They watched it split into two groups. And then, at 7:39 a.m., the signal disappeared. It disappeared because the planes had descended below the hills of the island on their final approach to their targets. At 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese bombs began to fall on Pearl Harbor. In that moment, the entire narrative shifted. The German mockery of America's blindness was suddenly, tragically, replaced by the failure of America's own system. The machine had worked. The scientists had done their job. The privates had done their job. But the bureaucracy, the lack of imagination, the sheer inability to believe that the impossible was happening had led to a catastrophe. The laughing in Berlin stopped that day because Hitler, in his arrogance, had mocked a sleeping giant. And now that giant was awake, and it was filled with a terrible, righteous anger. Pearl Harbor was a disaster, but it was also the crucible in which the modern U.S. military was forged. The questions, the what-ifs from that morning, echoed in every command center for the rest of the war. What is the radar telling us? Do we believe it? What is the worst-case scenario? The skepticism of the old generals evaporated overnight, replaced by a desperate, frantic demand for more radar. And the SCR-270, the machine born in that New Jersey shed, became the backbone of the American victory in the Pacific. It was no longer a failed experiment. It was the most valuable weapon in the arsenal. An SCR-270 at Guadalcanal during the desperate, bloody fighting in 1942 gave the Cactus Air Force, the handful of Marine pilots holding the island by a thread, the few precious minutes of warning they needed to get their Wildcat fighters into the air to meet the daily Japanese bombing raids. Those few minutes, provided by that radar, were the difference between holding the island and annihilation. That same radar system was deployed in the Battle of the Coral Sea and at Midway, guiding American planes, vectoring them toward the Japanese fleet. The Japanese, who had also been early pioneers in radar, had focused on small, ship-based sets. They, like the Germans, had failed to appreciate the game-changing power of long-range, early-warning air radar. It was a blind spot, and the Americans exploited it, ruthlessly. But what about the Atlantic? What about the mockery that had been loudest in Hitler's own backyard, in the cold gray waters where his U-boat wolfpacks were strangling the life out of Britain? This is where the other half of the radar story comes into play. The SCR-270 was a long-range but low-frequency radar. It was too big to fit on a plane. But the Tizard mission, with its cavity magnetron, had given American scientists the key to high-frequency microwave radar. The MIT Radiation Laboratory, or RAD Lab, was created almost overnight. It became a super laboratory, the greatest concentration of scientific minds in history. And their first, most urgent task was to take that British magnetron and turn it into a weapon to kill U-boats. The German U-boat was a submersible, not a true submarine. It had to spend most of its time on the surface running its diesel engines to recharge its batteries. It preferred to attack at night or in the foul weather of the North Atlantic, where a low-profile conning tower was invisible to the human eye. The U-boat captains felt safe in the dark and the fog.
That safety was about to end. The MIT Rad Lab, working at a frantic pace, developed the first airborne microwave radar, the ASV air-to-surface vessel radar. It was small enough to fit in the belly of a B-24 Liberator bomber or a British Sunderland flying boat. And it was a terror. Imagine you are a German U-boat commander. It is 3 a.m. in the middle of the Atlantic. The sea is rough, the fog is thick. You are on the surface, charging your batteries, secure in the knowledge that no enemy plane can possibly find you. Suddenly, a crude warning receiver in your Radio Shack, a device called a Metox, begins to squawk. The Metox was designed to pick up the old low-frequency radars. But this new, high-frequency radar, it was harder to detect. By the time your Metox screamed, the plane was already on top of you. Your lookouts would peer into the pitch blackness, seeing nothing. And then, two things would happen at once. A massive, blinding searchlight called a lead light would snap on, pinning your submarine in its beam. And at the exact same moment, a string of depth charges would rain down from the sky. The U-boat crews called it Metox Shrek, the Metox Terror. They were being hunted in the one place they thought they were safe. Hitler's mockery of America's blindness had been answered by an all-seeing eye that pierced the fog, the night, and the arrogance of his own navy. The effect was catastrophic for the German U-boat arm. In May of 1943, known as Black May, the Allies sank 41 U-boats in a single month.
Admiral Donitz, the head of the U-boat fleet, was forced to pull his boats from the North Atlantic. The lifeline to Britain was saved. And the weapon that did it, more than any other, was airborne radar. This is a story that should be told more often. It's not as simple as the British gave us radar. It's a story of parallel invention, of American scientists who were right but were ignored. It's a story of how their persistence, their refusal to give up, created a weapon that was ready just in time. When you hear the word radar, it's easy to think of it as a single thing, but it was an entire ecosystem of invention. The long-range SCR-270 that warned of the Pearl Harbor attack and later won the air battles of the Pacific. The SG radar that allowed the US Navy to fight and win battles in total darkness, baffling the Japanese. And the airborne microwave sets that destroyed the U-boat fleet. All of it came from that simple observation of a radio signal fluttering as a plane flew by. It came from the men who were told their idea was a worthless toy. When Hitler mocked America's coastal defenses, he was focused on guns and binoculars. He was thinking in 2 dimensions. But the war was being fought in 3 dimensions, and in a 4th, the invisible spectrum of radio waves. He mocked what he couldn't understand, and what his intelligence services failed to see. Looking back, it's a powerful lesson. It's a lesson that arrogance is the most dangerous blindfold a leader can wear. It's a reminder that you must never, ever underestimate a quiet, determined competitor, especially one you have dismissed as being asleep. The work of Colonel Blair and the Signal Corps team was not just a technical victory, it was a moral one. It was a testament to the belief that a good idea, pursued with integrity and persistence, can overcome even the most suffocating skepticism. This history, this entire global conflict, was defined by these secret technological battles. We've spent a lot of time today on radar, but this was just one piece of the puzzle. The story of the Tizard Mission itself, the black box that the British brought over, is a whole other journey, full of its own heroes and its own lessons. We appreciate your time and your attention. Thank you for letting us share this with you.